Hi everyone, this is a video looking at the EDUQAS GCSE English Language Paper 2 Question 1 and Question 3. So we're going to go through a model question based on the Ben Fogle and Captain Scott exam and look at Question 1 and Question 3. So the first text is based on these three guys here, Ben Fogle, James Cracknell and another guy, and they did a race to the South Pole. So question 1, the main things you've got to remember about question 1 are, it's 3 marks, so you'll get 3 questions, A, B and C worth 1 mark each. What do you need to write? So you need to write in full sentences. What do you need to remember? Specific details. So this is an information retrieval question, meaning they will ask you to find something and you've got to find it in the text. What do you need to avoid? So quotes, terminology, single words. So we don't just want you to put one word, and also we don't need any analysis. This should only take you 3 or 4 minutes, so don't waste time writing massive answers. And there you go, A, B and C up there. So that'll be question 1, so it's the first one on your page, so nice and easy. And you need to identify the keywords in the question and scan through the text to find them. So like I said, it's search and find, so it's testing your ability to identify information and ideas in the text. You'll be asked to look for explicit points, so this is the obvious bit, so for example, it was cold, and the implicit points, the subtle hidden meaning, so I'm not just saying it was cold, I'm saying he had to wear his coat as he slept. So I'm making the reader do a little bit work to read between the lines. So a few tips then, so use whole sentences but keep them brief, don't copy out whole chunks and sentences. The examiners call this indiscriminate copying or plagiarism, so if you're copying out huge chunks, just shows you don't really know the answer, so maybe remember to be specific with your answers. So I'm going to show you a few teacher tips for this question. Number 1. Read each question twice. So I know this seems simple, but a lot of people might get the wrong end of the stick. You might make a mistake what's needed in the question. So read each question twice. Number 2, read with the question in mind. Use a highlighter as you read to pick out key evidence that will help you answer the question. Teacher tip 3, be specific. Only highlight relevant words or phrases. Too much will make it difficult to work out which evidence to use. And there you go. So pause if you want to write down my teacher tips. So many of my students fail to gain full marks because they simply didn't read the question properly. Students need to answer in a simple sentence type answer. So for example, list 4 things from this part of the text about the man's physical appearance. He had wild eyes would be correct or be accepted, but a lot of students just put things like wild eyes. So it's not answering the question of things about the man's physical appearance, it just says wild eyes. Things like that will be incorrect and they won't be accepted. So make sure you just do a simple sentence. Really important on this question, like I said, it's 3 marks, should only take 3 or 4 minutes. If you can't find something in the text, just leave it. There's no point wasting 5 or 6 minutes looking for 1 mark. So what I would say to my students is if you can't find it, leave a couple of lines on your page, and if you want to go back to it at the end of the exam, you can do that. So here's the article we're looking at, so feel free to pause and read the article. So remember with this exam you'll get 2 texts, one from the 21st century, which is this one, and you'll get one from the 19th century later on. Questions 1 and 2 will always be in the 21st century text. So the questions are, read the article. A, why did Ben Fogle think he was going to die on his journey to the South Pole? B, how much time did the men spend skiing each day? C, how did James Cracknell cope with the long days on the expedition? So all you got to do, search and find, look for these questions in the exam. So tip is highlight the keywords and try and find them in the text. So maybe you could highlight in A, you could highlight die. In B, highlight skiing. In C, highlight James Cracknell. So remember the teacher tips, read each question twice, highlight key information, but only highlight information you need. So there's the answer, so pause if you want to read it yourself. If you want to get the exam, all you need to do is type in EDUQAS Ben Fogle into Google and you can find it there. So A, why did Ben Fogle think he was going to die on his journey to the South Pole? Well, the crevices can be a mile deep and I was terrified I would be dragged down. I thought I could die here. Okay, so he thought he was going to fall down a crevice. B, how much time do the men spend skiing each day? Around 16 hours a day. C, how did James Cracknell cope with long days on the expedition? It says that he and Cracknell listened to Andrew Marr's History of Modern Britain. So I've highlighted it in the text. Now I'm going to write down my answers. So A, why did Ben Fogle think he was going to die on his journey to the South Pole? He'd walked onto a dangerous crevasse. Okay, so I'm not going into massive detail. I don't need any analysis. I'm just answering the question. B, how much time did the men spend skiing each day? 16 hours a day. Really simple. But I'm not just putting 16 hours because that's not going to get me the mark. 16 hours a day makes sense. How did James Cracknell cope with the long days on the expedition? He listened to Andrew Marr's History of the Modern Britain. So it's all in the text here, and all I've done is put it into a simple sentence here for an easy 3 marks. So question 3, the only difference between question 3 and question 1 is basically the different text. So question 3 again is retrieval, so it's exactly the same as the second one. The only difference is you're looking at the 19th century text now. So there it is, question 3. So question 3 is very much like question 1, but will be on the 19th century text like I just said. Important is, don't get stressed out. A lot of students get stressed out because it's the 19th century. They start to think it's going to be even harder. This question is particularly hard, so just treat it the same as the 21st century one. You don't need to stress out about it. Just read the information and you should be able to answer this question pretty easily. So again, it's a search and find question just like question 1. So hopefully you'll be a bit better on this question now you've looked at the video. So to improve, just keep testing yourself against the clock for this question. It's quite an easy question to do if you give yourself 10 minutes, but give yourself 3 or 4 minutes to see if you can really get down to a really quick time on it. Hi, this question is looking at the EDUQAS GCSE English Language Paper 2 Question 2. This is the question that's looking at the writer's use of language. So there we go, question 2. And the question is, how does the writer of the newspaper article try to show that Ben Fogle's expedition to the South Pole was full of danger and difficulty? You should comment on what he says and his use of language, tone and structure. And it's 10 marks. This is the Ben Fogle and Captain Scott exam paper. So if you haven't got a copy of it, just go onto Google, type in EDUQAS Ben Fogle, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. So this question, here's a little structure. Question 2, how many marks? Well, it's worth 10 marks. How many points or quotes should you make? I think you should be making 6 to 8 points with quotes. This question should take you about 15 minutes, maybe 13 to 14, 15, but 6 or 8 points. It's really important that you get coverage, you track through the text and use as many quotes as you can in explaining why it shows the expedition was tough. What are the marks given for? Well, clear points are related to the quote, quotes to support points, terminology for how the writer presents impression. What do you need to avoid? Waffling. Okay, so we don't want to waffle. We don't want 7 or 8 lines in a PE. Just a couple of sentences, pick a quote, explain why that makes the expedition seem tough, and explain how the writer has done that. So like I said, it's 10 marks, it's 13 to 15 minutes. How many points do you need to use? 5 to 7. If you can go higher than that, then brilliant. So you need to use a range of quotes from the beginning, middle and end of the extract. So we don't just want, from an extract, we don't just want loads of quotes from the start. We want it all the way through, beginning, middle and end, to show the journey that the writer has taken on in the extract. So in the how question, you need to analyse the writer's use of language. What does analyse mean? It means to examine something carefully and in detail, then explain and interpret it. So in this question, we're going to comment on the effect of words and how they make the reader feel. So the writer has picked these words for a reason. It's not random. So why has the writer chosen this and what effect do they want the reader to have? So we're looking at where a writer deliberately, so on purpose, uses word to achieve a special effect. So for example, let's look at a really easy example. So one sentence you might find is, he awoke to a blizzard. So this is the kind of image we might get from a blizzard. So A little bit of a storm, but nothing too heavy. But let's change that sentence now to he awoke to a raging, howling blizzard. So then we would say that why has the writer chosen raging? Why has the writer used howling? What's the point of the writer using these adjectives? Well, the impression we get of raging is something like this: someone angry, something intimidating, someone violent. So that turns the blizzard from being something like that into a blizzard that maybe is something like that. A bit more of a storm. So it paints an image in the reader's mind that this storm is aggressive, it's angry, it's violent. So if we put that into a little sentence, the use of the adjectives raging and howling make the storm seem angry and punishing. So when we're looking at the questions, when we're looking at terminology, we're looking at these things: adjectives, verbs, word choice, adverbs, deforest, hyperbole, the structure, punctuation, sensory language and figurative language. It's really important that we use this stuff and get it correct, but we don't want to use it every point. We're not going to force anything. We're not going to whack the examiner over the head. But if you did 7 or 8 points, maybe if you used these terminology 3 or 4 times, that's really good. It's probably better to just use the word. If you don't know this terminology, just say the word raging, the word violent. That would be much better than saying the adverb violent and getting it wrong. But really, you should be revising these terms so by the time June comes in that exam, you're ready to use them. So like I just said, terminology is not needed on every point, so you can chill out a little bit with it, but 3 or 4 times during your answer, try and use it. And you don't always have to use the highest ones. You don't have to use simile or metaphor. Verbs and adjectives and adverbs are going to get you a real long way. So here's the question again: how does the writer of a newspaper article show that Ben Fogle's expedition to the South Pole was full of danger? You should comment on what he says, his use of language, tone and structure. So we're looking at this question in a minute. How does it seem difficult? How does it seem tiring? How does it seem dangerous? So we're going to look for language when we read the extract that makes the trip seem dangerous and difficult. And then we're going to zoom in on one word or 2 words phrases and examine them and analyse them in detail. So there's the extract there. So I'm not going to read through it, so you can pause through the extract. This is the 21st century article about these 3 guys going on an adventure in the Antarctic. So pause the video or read the paper that you've got, and then we can look at it. So here's just the first column on the left, and we're going to look for language that makes the trip seem dangerous and difficult. Okay, so we're going to pick out a few things here. So first of all, the actual first sentence is, it was the moment when Ben Fogle thought he was going to die. So I've zoomed in on that sentence and I've picked out the phrase going to die. Well, why does it make it seem dangerous and difficult? Well, it's a dramatic opening sentence for a start. So the technique is the dramatic opening sentence, and it makes us think straight away the stakes are really high, that Ben Fogle's life is at risk. So let's pick something else out. This was a huge crack in the ice. So there wasn't just a crack in the ice, it's not a tiny little thing. The adjective huge emphasises the danger. One more. And then at the bottom he says the hardest thing. So the use of the superlative, it shows there's been nothing tougher in Ben Fogle's life. All the trips he's been on, there's been nothing tougher than this trip. So that shows that this trip must be really difficult. So what I'd like you to do now, if it was my lesson, or you can just do it on your own, is your turn. So in that column, just in the left-hand column, not the whole extract, I want you to look for 5 more words or phrases that make it seem dangerous and difficult. So just from this column on the left, highlight 5 words or phrases that make the expedition seem dangerous and difficult. So like we've already done, you go through it, pick out things that you think the writer has used on purpose, deliberately, to make the expedition seem dangerous and difficult. Pause the video now and have a go. So these are my annotations. So we've talked about the dramatic opening sentence. So it's not just called an expedition, it's an adjective. Grueling makes it sound tough and hard. There isn't just a crevasse, it's a giant crevasse. So again, that emphasises the danger by saying, what connotations do we have with giant? Something is enormous. Then he doesn't just say he was anxious. Ben Fogle was terrified, shows he's very scared. Then we're given a statistic. They're not just going over 20 miles, they're going across 481 miles of snow in 18 days. So a huge feat, a huge feat of endurance these guys have to do. Then it says it takes a toll on our bodies. So maybe this is sort of implying that it's just all the days they've been out, that bit by bit, the word told, bit by bit, it's making damage to their body. Okay, then we talked about the hardest thing, we've talked about that one, and then we almost get a list of things that have gone wrong with Ben Fogle's body. He started off with frostbite, burnt lips, got blisters on his feet, hypothermia. So all those things that the writer has purposely listed, these things to make it sound, all these ailments that add up sound really bad. And then just the last sentence, it says he doesn't think he was going to finish the race. It was so bad he thought he couldn't continue. So we're going to analyse these words and phrases in a bit more detail and explain their effect. So terrified, so we've talked about that one. So he wasn't just scared, he was terrified, which means he was really, really petrified. He almost couldn't go on. It was almost something that made him frozen with fear. So first of all, what is connotations? Well, connotations are images or ideas associated with a word or phrase. So if we look at the terrified one that we just talked about, words or images I would associate with terrified would be frozen, scared, alarm, horror, fright, panic. So what I've done is the small ones like frozen, those are the words that I think link a little bit, and then the big links I've put in bigger writing. So the writer has used these words to tell the reader that Ben Fogle was frozen, he was scared, he was alarmed, there was horror, panic, fright. All these images or ideas are automatically put into the reader's head through just that choice of that verb. Again, burnt. So pause the video. What connotations could we have with burnt? He didn't just, his lips weren't just sore, they were burnt. So sore, sun, scorched, horror, pain, heat. So there you go. So the word burnt I have with me is on this expedition he's in pain, his body is in pain, which makes it very difficult. So then what I want you to do now is pause the video and have a go at doing this on your own. Use the word grueling or hostile, you choose, and see what words you can link to that. Okay, so giant, what connotations does that have? And why has the writer chosen to use it? Because that's basically what the question is. What connotations do the words in the quotes have? But why has the writer chosen to use it? The writer wants the text to seem difficult and dangerous, so he's chosen words deliberately to do that. So let's look at the words he's chosen and why he's used them. So giant, so that is an image that I would link to giant. A big, intimidating, violent, dangerous, enormous. So if this crevasse, this crack was like this, then this crack is dangerous, it's enormous. This crack is ready to split at any moment. So how are we going to structure our answer? So there you go. Ben Fogle's expedition was full of danger and difficulty. So we've got to make 5 to 8 points using quotes. So number one, you can write this down if you want. Use the sentence starter the writer uses. Number two, use an adjective and technique. So we're going to say what technique the writer does it, and then maybe use an adjective just to describe it. So for example, the writer uses the powerful adjective. The writer uses the peaceful simile. The writer uses the violent verb. So the adjective is in the blue and the actual technique the writer does is in yellow. If you don't do the blue, it's not the end of the world, but we really do want to get that technique in there. But I'm going to use the writer chooses the powerful adjective. And it's giant. So the writer, so then number three, use my quote. So the writer uses the powerful adjective giant. And then number four, to show what? Well, the writer uses the powerful adjective giant to show how dangerous the expedition was. So that's almost answering my question. And then number five, what is the connotation of the chosen word? Why has the writer decided to choose giant as opposed to big or whatever? Yeah, but so giant suggests, we're going back to our connotations, we're going back to this, yeah? So what does giant suggest? Well, to me, giant suggests the crevasse was intimidating, enormous, and emphasises the danger Fogle experienced. So I'm saying that the use of the word giant as opposed to big makes it sound really intimidating, and we can almost imagine ourselves being there and hating and being panicking like Ben Fogle would panic. So there you go. So here's it all together. The writer uses the powerful adjective giant to show how dangerous the expedition was. Giant suggests the crevasse was intimidating, enormous, and emphasised the danger Fogle experienced. So really mature, really great point to make. So even though this seems quite long, it's only 2 sentences, and we probably don't need to use all of it every single time, but using terminology will get you far, and there it all is together. So there, my black is my sort of point, my red is my quote, and my blue is my explanation, and there it all is together. So here's a sheet, and it's available on the college website through Moodle. So it's point, technique, quote, connotation of quote. So what I want you to do now is try and write 3 different answers for that first column. And if you need help on quotes, here's some quotes I would say to do. Going to die, grueling expedition, dry and crevasse. We've done dry and crevasse and huge crack. Terrified, 481 miles of snow, hardest thing I've ever done. I thought we were not going to finish. Frostbite, burn my lips, blisters, hypothermia. So try and write 3 answers like we've just done based on these quotes. If you want to use a different quote, that's absolutely fine, but remember, this is just for the left hand column so far. Use any sheets or use any notes you've done to help you. Okay, so now I want you to highlight 5 words or phrases that make the expedition seem dangerous and difficult from the rest of the article. So we've done the left, now do the middle and the right column. See if you can get 5 from the rest of the article. So here's mine. So we go through the ones in the middle. So he says he's worried he might lose his nose. So that's a really explicit image, a horrible image of someone having their nose off. Then they will say the medical things will clear up in a couple of months. So that's dangerous because it shows it's not like a cold or something that's going to be okay in a month. A couple of months is a long time to recuperate. And quite like the ailments we had on the first column, we are told that the other members of the team also had things wrong, frostbite and pneumonia. So we're getting lots of facts there and factual information about the other people. Another reason it would be difficult, it was -50 at times, which sounds absolutely horrendous. Then we're told there's a vast hostile landscape. We're told not even a single bird would survive there or goes there. We're told that they skied for 16 hours a day, which is really extreme. We're told that they spend 9,000 calories a day, but they only consume 3,500. We're told that the food they're having now, that in England, where we are, we would think it was disgusting, the food they would have. We were told that Ben Fogle, the way he copes with it, if he just kept his mind on the skiing the whole time, he would go crazy, he would think. But he mentally goes somewhere else, so he's mentally got to switch off. So here's a little box that you can do like as a little activity. So we won't do this like now, but if you want to pause and have a go. So on the left there are quotes in the white, and all I want you to do in the blue is tell me what technique has been used and why is it dangerous, difficult. So for example, Ben Fogle thought he was going to die, a dramatic opening sentence. Why is it dangerous? Well, it shows that he might die. Giant crevasse, what giants underline, what is giant? Well, it's an adjective. Why has it been used? It emphasizes danger. Huge crack, again, huge is an adjective. Why is it dangerous? Well, it shows that the ice could crack at any moment. And all the other ones, try to do a technique, try to do why is it dangerous. So pause the video now. So really big tip for you is write the answers and actually highlight the answers top to bottom. So when you're writing your answers, don't write one thing from the first paragraph, then the next thing from the 5th paragraph, then go back to the first paragraph. Try to do it in an order. 1, because it's nice and easy for the examiner, but 2, it's really simple to track your answers. And also you might see a little bit of a pattern form where maybe the character or the main person in the extract, their mood might change, or they might take a journey of some kind. So here's all the answers I've got. We've only talked about 1 so far. I've done 11. You would only need to do 5 or 6, but try to use those 7 or 8 quotes. The examiners love you to track the text and love you to do as many quotes as you can. So we're going to look at these in detail. So like I said, you needed 11. That looks like, I did 11. That looks like a huge amount. However, you could probably get away with doing even less than I've got on the screen now. So we're going to look at each one in detail, and then hopefully gives you a good idea of, I really want to get away from doing 7 or 8 lines PEs. We really want to do 2 sentences, move on, 2 sentences, move on. So the quote is he thought he was going to die. Okay, the writer shows Fogle's expedition was full of danger with the dramatic opening sentence, he thought he was going to die. This shows it was very dangerous as they were risking their lives. So my red is my point and my technique, my black is my quote, and my blue is my explanation. So all I've said here, that the fact he says he was going to die, that makes it sound dangerous, as we know that Ben Fogle was risking his life. Quote 2, grueling. The journey is shown to be difficult with the adjective grueling. This suggests the trip was physically and mentally exhausting. So all I've done is zoomed in on the word grueling. What does it mean? Well, it means it's sort of exhausting. It's meant to be painful. Giant and huge, this is the one we've done before. The writer uses the powerful adjective giant to show how dangerous the expedition was. Giant suggests the crevasse was intimidating, enormous, and emphasises the danger Fogle experienced. We are also told the crack is huge. This adjective suggests it is so big that it may crack at any moment, which elevates the tension for the reader. Terrified, panic, and could die here. The reader also knows it is dangerous, as Fogle is not just anxious but terrified. The verb panic also shows Fogle has lost his composure and thinks he could die here. The writer also makes it sound difficult by using statistics, so that's my technique. We are told they pulled their sledges across 481 miles of ice in 18 days. So why does that sound difficult? Well, it just does, doesn't it? It sounds almost impossible, which seems an almost impossible feat. Another stat given is the temperature at -50, which makes the trip seem miserably cold and a huge test of endurance. The writer says Fogle thinks the trip is the hardest thing I've ever done. The superlative hardest suggests it couldn't have got any tougher than the conditions he encounters. Obviously, if it's the hardest thing he's ever done, then he's never going to experience anything more than that. The writer shows how dangerous it was by the various medical problems they suffered: frostbite, blisters, hypothermia and pneumonia. The vast array of medical problems suggest the trip is extremely hazardous, and some of these could be deathly. Again, I've said my technique is they are showing all the medical problems. That's my quote, and I've just said, well, why is it dangerous? Why is it difficult? Well, all the problems suggest that really they're never going to get through it in a healthy way. The writer uses negative adjectives, that's my technique, vast and hostile, to describe the landscapes. And now I'm going to zoom in on vast and hostile. These both suggest the emptiness and aggression of the South Pole, while suggesting they have no help if trouble comes. So if it's vast and hostile, they've got no help. The fact not even a single bird lives there suggests that any living thing will struggle to survive there, or at least want to live there. So it's such an awful experience that no living thing really wants to live there. The expedition sounds extremely challenging with the statistics the writer chooses to give the reader. Skiing for 16 hours a day makes the workload seem torturous both mentally and physically. The men are not eating enough to gain energy. Burnt 9,000 calories but consumed only 3,500. The verb burnt suggests the men are almost in pain through the physical energy they are using. The writer also makes it seem challenging by comparing the trip to life at home in the UK, as the food they are eating would be described as disgusting here. This shows how harsh the conditions were, because in the South Pole it became food from heaven. Last one. Finally, the writer makes it seem mentally challenging for Fogle, as we're told he goes somewhere else mentally. So why does somewhere else mentally mean it's difficult for us? Well, this suggests the expedition is so mentally draining he needs to switch off to complete it. So the writer has chosen to use the quote somewhere else mentally, and we've got to say why that. Why has he used it? Well, he's used it because it suggests it's so awful that if they can't keep their mind on skiing all the time, that they've got to switch off and almost zone out. An effect on the reader: if you've got time, you can do a little conclusion. The writer makes it seem mentally and physical disintegrating expedition, where we admire the men for their determination and courage. So all the things, all the quotes we talked about, I've just summed up a little bit there. So there you go, there it all is. There's the 11 we've just gone through. Remember, you'd only have to do 6 or 7 if you've got time, 5 if you're really struggling. But even in this 7, I haven't just got 7 quotes. I've probably got about 12 or 13 quotes in this 7. Okay, there it all is. If you want to look at it, go through Moodle. There's a grade 9 answer there for you to download. Here's a grade 3 or 4 example. Remember, we're looking at grade 9, but this is a grade 3 or 4 example that we want to do better on. So first of all, there's not enough. It's a 15-minute question, we need lots. Secondly, there's not enough quotes. There's probably 3 quotes. We're looking for 7 or 8. And also, the examiner's put, there's some detail, but there's no analysis. So they've not said why the writer has used the words. They've not said how, what effect they've got. And also, limited coverage means they've not gone through the whole text. They've only picked out 3 quotes. The examiner wants to do 7 or 8 quotes all the way through the extract. This one seems to be just from the first column. So band explanation. So when we're doing our explanation, if you're saying giant, we're saying this suggests it's enormous. That is zooming on the word and saying why they picked that word giant. What we don't want to do is have things like this. Don't use the following explanations. It makes the reader want to read on. It puts an image in the reader's mind. It makes it interesting for the reader. We always get these in these exams. These are going to get you no marks. These are vague, and these basically could be about any text. So you're picking out a word and you're just saying why that word has been chosen. So giant has been chosen to suggest that the crack is enormous. Hostile has been chosen to show the aggression of the landscape. No other bird has been chosen to show that no other living animal wants to be there. They've been chosen for a reason. Be specific. Don't just say it makes the reader want to move on. So summary for the question: focus on what happens and how the language is used. Focus on what the writer is doing. Try to use sentence starters that the writer uses. Try to use correct subject terminology. You don't have to use it all the time, but use it at least 4 or 5 times. Explain the effect on the reader, and try to use as many quotes as you can. 6, 7, 8 quotes if you can. That's it for this video on the how question. Hi, welcome to this video looking at question 2, question 4 of the EDUQAS GCSE English Language. This question is looking at how well do you think Scott's diary captures his feelings about his journey to the South Pole. This is the evaluation stroke impressions question for the non-fiction text. So there it is, question 4. So for question 4, the key facts we got to know about it. How many marks? Is 10 marks. How many points or quotes should you make? I'd say 6 to 8 points with quotes. What are the marks given for? Clear points related to quote, quotes to support points, terminology for how the writer presents impression, and also you need to give your opinion, reaction to the text in some way. What do you need to avoid? Waffling. So we don't want massive 7-line paragraphs for 1 point. We want loads of points, loads of quotes. So the question is again, how well do you think Scott's diary captures his feelings about his journey to the South Pole? You should comment on what his feelings are about the expedition over the 3 diary entries, 3 separate days. How well do you think his diary makes his feelings clear? So here's the text. If you want to pause the video and read it, otherwise have a look in my description of this video and there will be a link to see how you get the exam paper. So it's a 10-mark question, so you should be spending 13 to 15 minutes on it. Okay, so we're looking at how many points or quotes. Well, we just talked about it, so looking at 5, 6, 7, 8 quotes. If we haven't got the time, just do 5 or 6. If you've got a bit more time, 7 or 8. So you need to use a range of quotes like I just said, but also it's really important it's from the beginning, middle and end of the extract. So we don't just want lots taken from the start of the extract like we've got here. We want to track. The exam board like the use of the word tracking the text. That means going through all the way through and finding bits that we're going to talk about, start, middle and end. So question 4 is very much like question 2, it's the how question. It's looking at language, but we're also going to add your own opinion. You've got to give your own opinion on how well you think the writer has done something. So you've got to comment on the effect of the words, and you've also got to think to yourself, how do they make the reader feel? So the writer has chosen these words on purpose. So for example, this exam question is looking at how things are difficult and so for example, this question is looking at how well Scott captures feelings. So we're going to look at the feelings that Scott has and then say, how does the writer, why has the writer chosen particular words to get that across to the reader? So we're looking where a writer deliberately uses words to achieve a special effect. So really obvious example, really small example. Say we've got a sentence, there was a crack in the ice. So we've got this picture here. That might mean like a small little crack that isn't a big danger. However, if we change that to there was a giant crack in the ice, so we use an adjective, giant. Well, why is the writer could have just put crack, but they've decided to use that adjective giant for a reason, and they've decided to use it to get across to the reader that the crack was almost like this, almost was a huge, giant, enormous, intimidating, powerful, violent crack. That makes it much more interesting for the reader, and we get to know Scott's feelings more because it's not just a small thing, but a giant thing that's almost life-threatening. So if we look at that, so giant suggests the crack was intimidating, enormous and emphasised the danger. So all I'm saying is why the writer has chosen that word and what are the connotations. So in this question we're looking at using terminology, so these things here, adjectives, verbs, word choice and so on. However, it's really important you get to revise these because you're going to do better if you can say that as an adjective. You're not going to get marks for just saying it's an adjective. You're going to say what effect the adjective has. But it's really important that you try and revise all this terminology. However, if you can't get it into your head, it is much better than just saying the word giant. and getting it and just saying that, rather than saying, for example, the verb giant and getting it wrong. Obviously we want to get it right to get really high marks, but if you don't know it, it's better to just to say the word rather than get it wrong. Obviously we want to say the adjective giant to really get to the top marks. So although I just said we're going to use terminology, you're not going to use every single point. So if you're doing 5 or 6 or 7, maybe use the terminology 3 or 4 times. We don't want to hit the examiner over the head with it. We don't want to seem like we're forcing the terminology down their throats, but definitely use it maybe 50% of the time. So remember, the question is, how well do you think, so us as readers, think Scott captures his feelings about the poll, what his feelings and how he communicates these feelings. So you're going to be focused on your response to the text, so what you think is the text. So your response to the text will be different from what your classmates will be. So just focus on what you think. However, generally you're probably going to say the writer does things well, then spend all your time saying you think they were rubbish. Okay, so your response. So an example would be, at the start I feel Scott captures his feelings well. Scott makes it clear he is tired when. Scott is successful showing his pain when. So obviously then we're going to talk about the quotes, but these sentence starters are really going to help us. So you're going to look for language in the text that captures how he feels about the expedition. So does he feel tired? Does he feel frustrated, angry, happy, whatever? So then we're going to zoom in. We don't want huge quotes. We don't want you writing out a sentence and a half. We're just looking for 1 or 2 word quotes, so words and phrases. So here's the extract. So look at your copy or read from the video if you want to. And I'm just going to look at the first day. Remember, we're going to comment on the 3 days in the answer, but just for now, just with us, we're going to look at the first day. So this is the first day extract. This is the Tuesday. And I'm going to look for language that captures how he feels about the trip. So I'm just going to do a 2 or 3 here, and then you can have a go. So first thing I'm going to pick out is, he doesn't just say he woke to a blizzard, it was a raging, howling blizzard. So why has the writer used those adjectives, raging and howling? Well, for me, it almost suggests that the weather is intimidating and frightening. Raging is almost something that is angry. Here, he didn't just have a breakfast, the adjective thin is used. So that suggests, well, how does he feel? Well, it suggests that he doesn't feel happy with his breakfast. He suggests that thin suggests starving, unhappy. It's an adjective that suggests fragility, someone who is weak. And let's look at one more together. And then he says, we had our own share of ill fortune. Well, what does that tell me about his feelings? Well, he suggests ill fortune. It suggests that he feels like he's had a lot of bad luck on the trip. So now I want you to do is, after you have a look at that, it's your turn. So look for 3 more words and phrases from the first day that capture how we feel. So I just want you to look at the first day. So this paragraph, this diary entry, we're going to look at the other ones later on in the video. But just for now, have a look at the video, have a look at your exam, highlight 3 more words or phrases that capture how it feels, and try to make the same kind of analysis and notes that we've done on this part of the video here. So here's my annotation. So we've talked about raging, howling blizzard. We've talked about thin breakfast. We've talked about ill fortune. However, we could say the writer purposely uses a rhetorical question. What on earth does such weather mean at this time of year? So what on earth almost suggests he's bewildered. He can't believe what has happened. Then the superlative greatest is used. So it's not just a snowfall. It's the greatest. So it means he's never seen anything as bad as this snowfall, as much snow come down ever. So that shows you it's pretty bad. Then we say it's pretty wretched. Then he uses repetition. He doesn't just say it's wet, he says it's very, very wet. So the repetition of that adjective just tells the reader that he's obviously feeling really miserable. He's absolutely soaked through. And the last bit of the day, he says he has biscuits, although the last of the horse meat. So then we could probably look at that and say, although it's nice that he's had the horse meat, he's happy as the horse meat, it then gets negative again because it's the last of it. So he did have a small pleasure, but that small pleasure is now gone. So now we're going to analyse these words and phrases in a bit more detail and explain their effect. So raging, so it said it was a raging blizzard. So what do we look at when we think raging? We think of this sort of thing, don't we? Someone who is angry, someone who is violent, like this image here. So what do connotations mean? Well, the connotations are the images or ideas associated with the word or phrase. So what would I associate with raging? Well, I'd probably associate these things: explosive, volatile, violent, horror, angry, intimidating. So all these things are connotations of the word raging. So when the writer has used that word, these are the things that they want the reader to get into their heads. So again, with thin, what can we say about the connotations with thin? I'd say small, food, fragile, hungry, starving, weak. So if he feels like this, Scott feels like this when he's eating, we're meant to infer from that he is feeling fragile, he's feeling weak. These are his feelings that the writer is getting across to us, that he needs food, that he's hungry, that he's starving. Okay, now pause the video or do whatever you want to do, but here's two. Have a go at doing these two, or maybe just one. So pick howling. What connotations do we do with that? Pick greatest. What connotations do we have with greatest? So greatest, let's look at that one. What connotations does it have? And number two, why has the writer chosen to use it? This is basically what the question is. Why has the writer chosen the words, and what effect does it have? So greatest, I would say, it means the best, it means the most, it means enormous. If something's great, it's strong. So how are we going to structure our answer? Okay, remember the question is, how well do you think Scott captures his feelings? What are his feelings? How does he make them clear? So number one, I'm going to use the sentence starter. I feel Scott is successful with capturing his feelings. So remember the question is, what is my opinion? And my opinion is that he's successful. Yeah, so he's doing it well. So that's my sentence starter. Number two, I'm going to use an adjective and technique. So what has he done? Well, I'm going to say he's used a powerful adjective, a peaceful simile, or violent verb. So what I'm saying is, what technique has the writer used? I'm going to look at adjective, and what kind of adjective is it? Well, is it a peaceful one? Is it a calm? Is it violent? Well, I'm going to say I'm going to be talking about raging and howling. So I'm going to say he's going to use powerful adjectives. So that's number two, adjective and quote. Number three is the quote. Okay, so what quote? The quote I'm using is raging or howling. So I feel Scott is successful with capturing his feelings by using the powerful adjectives raging and howling. Okay, and what does it show? To show how terrible the weather was. And what are the connotations of raging? Well, raging, we've already talked about with this image. Raging suggests the weather is violent and intimidating. Okay, so put it together, I feel Scott is successful with capturing his feelings by using the powerful adjectives raging and howling. To show how bad the weather was, raging suggests the weather is violent and intimidating. And then after that I would talk about howling. So all I've done there is said what the writer does to show his feelings, what quote he's chosen, and why have they chosen that quote. And there it is all together. So I want you to have a look at the rest of it and try to have a look at these quotes and see if you can make 3 answers. So pick 3 of the 5 and see if you can do an answer like what I've just done based on these quotes. Use any sheets or the structure we've just gone through to help you. Okay, so after you've done that, use the whole extract now. Remember, we've only used the first day so far, and highlight 5 words or phrases, 1 or 2 words that capture how Scott feels through the journey, and then we'll go through it. So if we're looking at the rest of the extract, we've done the top paragraph. Okay, so miserable, utterly miserable. So we've got repetition there. Also, we've got short sentences. Also, we've got adverbs. So we've got 3 things in that little 3 words we could talk about. So miserable, miserable. So the repetition emphasises his feelings, how awful he's feeling. And so does the adverb. And the short sentences even picks out more for the reader. So really, it's almost like an explicit tie to the reader how fed up he is. Then it said the wind, the tempest, so the weather continues to rage violently. Again, it's an aggressive adverb. It's not just falling, but rage is anger. So we've almost got 2 words there that scream anger and violence. Then it says the snow is steadily climbing higher above the walls. So that means the snow is getting worse, and then it's steadily climbing. So the adverb steadily suggests that bit by bit it's getting up. There's almost like no way out, no way they're going to stop it. Then it says a hopeless feeling descends. So obviously he's feeling sort of panicked. He's feeling like there's no way out. And then sort of at the bottom now I've put sum up 10. So one thing you will get marks on for in this question is documenting the progress of change. So all the way through we are 3-dimensional. We're not going to have the same feeling for 3 days. So there will be some permutations, some changes in the way he feels. And this last couple of sentences here, we could argue there's some sort of positivity there. So instead of saying how words like miserable, we're getting words like pleasant. Yeah, so a bit of a change. However, in the 3rd day we go back down in mood to maybe losing hope. So he now says it's now serious. So even though it might have sounded awful before, the word now serious suggests that it's really getting bleak. Then it says that he's feeling obviously miserable because they think they might have to kill the animals, which obviously is going to make the trip even more difficult. And then it says there's no sign of dying down, no sign of an end. So Obviously there's no way they think they're going to get out, but also the repetition of no sign suggests that there's no indication they're going to get out of this. And then it says utterly impossible, so impossible is a really strong word in it, and all these things in this paragraph here suggest that he's lost hope of maybe getting out of the situation he's found himself in. So here's a little box that might help us for this question. So in the white is the quote, and in the blue is the technique and how does it show his feelings. We'll go through a few together and then you can maybe finish the table. So we've talked about the raging, howling blizzard. So what technique is used? Raging and howling is an adjective. How does it show his feelings? Well, it shows that he's feeling angry or intimidated by the weather. That's meant to say violent. Thin breakfast, well, again, the adjective is the technique, and how does it show? It shows us he's starving, he's unhappy, he's feeling weak. Very, very wet. So what technique do you think is being used there? Miserable, utterly miserable. So short sentences, but what other techniques? We've talked about it. So all the way through, just say what technique is being used and how does it show the feelings, and complete the blue box. So we want to write our answers in order, top through bottom. So we don't want an answer from the top paragraph, then one from the bottom paragraph, and switching all the way through. So go through in a nice order, top to bottom, the things you've highlighted. And if you want to get top marks, we need to do the things that I've just mentioned. So look at the way this animal changes. So we need a comment on the change of feeling that Scott has over the whole extract. So not just for this extract, whatever question number you have on a different exam, you need a comment on the change, the feelings that the person has. It's very unlikely that the person is going to have to feel the same way all the way through. So talking about commenting on the change of feelings that Scott has over the whole extract, I want you to look at each day, the Tuesday, the Wednesday and the Thursday, and summarise Scott's feelings in 2 or 3 words. Okay, so so day 1, day 2, just give me a few words to describe how he feels. So I would say day 1 he's angry and frustrated, day 2 he's miserable but there are some positives, and then day 3 I would say the feelings are that there's no hope. So if we comment on them in our answer, we're going to be looking towards the top end. So here's all the things that we're going to talk about. I've got 8 here. You probably would need 5, because although I said you want 6 or 7 or 8 quotes, I've probably got a couple of quotes in each of these points I'm making. So if you use 7 or 8 quotes, you're going to be doing really well. So there's my 8, and you probably would need 5 or 6. And in the red here is where I've highlighted my quotes. Okay, and you want to get to top marks, then you're going to comment on the change, like I said. So in my red here, I'm not going to analyse the paragraphs, I'm just going to show you what I've highlighted in red. So on number 1 I've put on the first day, Scott blah blah blah. Number 2, I feel Scott's feelings become more positive. 3, however, we sense a negative change in Scott's feelings. So just 3 times during my whole answer I've commented on the change of feelings that Scott has. So let's look at each quote in detail. So we've done this one. The quote is raging or howling. I feel Scott is successful with capturing his feelings by using the powerful adjectives. Raging, howling to show how bad the weather was. Raging suggests the weather is violent and intimidating Scott. Howling is a negative adjective which makes the reader feel the storm is a haunting and painful presence. So my red is my point, my black is my quote, and my blue is my connotation. What does the quote suggest? So all I'm saying is, why has the writer used the word raging? Why has the writer used the word howling? What does howling mean? Well, it's negative and it suggests like a haunting, almost like a ghost, almost a painful experience. Thin breakfast. On the first day, Scott successfully shows his frustration and unhappiness with his thin breakfast. Okay, so why has thin been used by the writer? This adjective shows Scott and the rest of the group are starving, weak and fragile. This shows us the feelings. We're linking back to the question. What on earth? Scott tells the reader they have suffered bad luck on the trip as they had more than our share of ill fortune, and he shows his bewilderment with his rhetorical question, what on earth? So I've changed it up a little bit there of my structure, but I've still got my point, evidence, technique and explanation. All very, very wet. He gets his frustrations across well. So again, I'm linking back to the question, I'm giving my opinion on whether I think the writer has done something well. He gets his frustrations across well when he describes the tent as all very, very wet. This repetition of the adjective emphasises how soaked their living quarters are, and they all be mighty uncomfortable. So see how they've got that trick of, if I can get another quote in there, I'm going to use another quote to show that I'm tracking through the text. Miserable, utterly miserable. Scott explicitly shows us his state of mind, so that means he's doing it in a really obvious way. When on the next day he's miserable, utterly miserable. The repetition of miserable emphasises unhappiness, and the adverb utterly suggests he's completely dissatisfied with his situation. The use of the aggressive adverb, again I'm using that adjective to describe his technique, violently, and the verb rage to describe the storm, suggests the blizzard is harming Scott literally and figuratively. The reader can feel Scott's pain. So I'm saying that using the word violently and rage almost suggests that it's hurting him physically, like violently, so it's actually hurting him, and also sort of mentally and emotionally and metaphorically it's hurting him. And also I've done a little sentence at the end just to show how it's affecting the reader, so the reader can feel Scott's pain by these adverbs. Steadily and hopeless feeling descends. We feel Scott's mood is becoming more desperate as the situation is getting worse. The adverb steadily to describe the snow climbing suggests he is slowly being engulfed in the storm, and the hopeless feeling descends suggests Scott is almost submitting to the storm's power. A break at last, and but. I feel Scott's feelings become more positive, so I'm commenting on change of feelings. As he says there is a break at last, and the use of but when describing his cup of tea suggests he is grateful for some sanctuary from the bleakness. So I'm saying that Scott really gets across well that he is a bit of a change in personality, change of feeling, and I'm just saying that despite all the awful stuff, because he's used the word but, it's almost suggesting, well, there was some upside to something. Now serious, no sign, and utterly impossible. However, we sense a negative change. Again, I've gone back, I'm changing feelings. In Scott's feelings on the third day when he feels the situation is hopeless. He thinks the situation is now serious and they have to sacrifice the animals, which means the expedition will become even more difficult, because obviously they're using the animals to carry stuff. If they haven't got them, they've got to do it themselves. The repetition of no sign shows Scott sees no way out of the situation, and utterly impossible suggests Scott has lost some hope of completing the expedition. So I've got 4 quotes in there, and I'm explaining why that shows the negativity and how Scott feels hopeless. So again, there they all are together as an 8. You have to do 6. Okay, and there it all is on one page. So I'll put this up on Moodle so you can download this and see what like a grade 9, what a really good answer looks like. Here's a grade 2 example. So first of all, you'll see there's a limited response, not enough quotes by a million miles, not enough depth. Also, they haven't really evaluated and said why or how the writer has used language. Here's a grade 4 or 5 example, so if you want to pause, read it through. So there is some relevant stuff in there. However, sometimes it goes off onto a tangent. Basically, not a lot of the time it's not accurate, not convincing. They haven't used the right quotes, but still they've only used 4 or 5 quotes. We want to really get to that 6, 7 to push us really up. Also, they haven't commented on change, so we want to comment on change. So band explanations. So when you're talking about your explanations, we want to zoom in on the word. So we've zoomed in on raging and said it's volatile, it's violent. We've zoomed in on thin to say that it sounds weak, fragile. What we don't want you to do is use a quote and then say things like, it makes the reader want to read on. It puts an image in the reader's mind. It makes it interesting for the reader. All of these things are statements and vague and can be made about any text. And to be frank, they're made by students who don't really know what to put. So remember, pick a quote and just say why that word has been used. So remember, for question 4, it's 10 marks. You're going to get 6 to 8 points, please, with quotes. What are the marks given? Clear points with quotes to support point. Terminology, but not all the time. Giving your opinion, really important for this question, and you need to avoid waffling. So if you look at all my ones, okay, if you look at my ones here, they're all 2 sentences. Some of them might be 3, but all 2 sentences, 3 sentences. What we don't want is an 8 sentence PE where really you're going to be lucky to get 2 marks and you're going to waste a lot of time. So it'd be really important that you don't really waffle. If you follow all these tips, hopefully you'll be really successful in this question. Hi, welcome to this video on question 5 of the EDUQAS GCSE English Language paper 2. This is looking at the first comparison question. There's 2 comparisons in the exam. This is question 5, and this is explain what we learned about the food Scott and Fogle took with them on their expeditions to the South Pole. So there you go. It's the last but one penultimate question in the exam. This is the first of 2 comparison questions where you'll be looking at both texts in the exam. So tips for this question. It's the first compare question. It's worth 4 marks. It's only worth 4 marks, so we're not spending loads of time on it. So we need to make 2 points really, but we need quotes for each one. So we need a quote and explanation for each extract for each point. What do you need to avoid? Terminology, lengthy explanation. So basically what that means is we're not saying things like the adjective is used, the verb is used, the metaphor, and we're not doing point, evidence, explain. So we're not making a point and then explaining why the writer has used this language. It's almost like an information retrieval question, really, looking at both texts. So again, the question is, look at both texts, explain what we learned about the food Scott and Fogle took them on their expeditions. So this question wants you to synthesize information from two texts. This means you must read both texts carefully, find and then combine the information required in your answer. Like I said, it's worth 4 marks, so we should be spending 5 to 6 minutes on it. How many points and quotes do you need to use? We need to make 2 points with a quote from both extracts on each. So the question is basically looking at you identifying basic similarities and differences. In the 10-mark question for question 6, you're going to be comparing in a bit more detail and analysing the language. But this for question 5, you're identifying basic similarities and differences. So like I just said, you can say both texts are the same or different. Don't just get into the habit of saying things are the same. If things are different, you comment on that too. And be clear which text you're talking about. There's nothing really more annoying than you working really hard, but if you haven't put which text it's from, you're not going to get marks. So a really obvious one to do with this one is just call it by the writer's surname. So it's Scott and Fogle. So each time you're talking about the quote, just say Scott Fogle. So like I said earlier, terminology is not needed. So if you want to shove it in, because you find it easy, then it's fine. But if you struggle with it, if it's going to take you a bit of time, I wouldn't bother with it too much. Okay, so similar or different. So things that we can comment on in this question are similar or different, these things. So are they similar and different about the ideas talked about, the point of view, the language used, structure. So you can look at both the text here, and if you want the exam question, I will put the link to a copy of the exam question in the comment on the description on the YouTube video. Also, if you went into Google and typed in EDUQAS Ben Fogle, I'm sure you could get it. So you can look at both extracts, and then you're going to track through both texts, so go from top to bottom, and I want you to look for key parts about the question. So basically any time it mentions food on the trip, and highlight those key points. So here's both extracts again. Here's the Fogle one, the Ben Fogle. So you're going to look through this text and track through it and highlight key points. So really, it's only in this top section here. So let's zoom in on this section. So here's what it says about the food. Okay, so here's the stuff it says. So basically, to sum up, it says that they enjoyed the food. So they enjoyed the breakfast from Ben Fogle. That they had lots of food. So they had salami, chocolate, cheese, jelly babies, sour chicken, spaghetti, bolognese, spicy mince, fish pie. They also say that when they added the water with powder, they had powdered food, that people in the UK would think it was disgusting. But they also say to them it was like heaven, so they really enjoyed it. That's what the Ben Fogle text said. So now if we look at the Captain Scott extract, that's the whole text. This one, it's a bit more spread out. So here's the main parts. But to sum up, they said they had a thin breakfast, meaning they had a small breakfast, hardly had anything. They didn't have a lot of food, so that's different to the Ben Fogle one. They both had sugar, so they both had sugar to pep themselves up. And they also said here that they used it to, so a bit like Ben Fogle, they said enjoyed it. Here, Scott says they used it to raise their spirits. So they were in a bad mood, but they actually used their supper really to pep them up. They raised their spirits, they boosted their morale. So we use this table. Did they have a lot of food? What did they have? Did food give them enjoyment? Any other similarities or difference? Pause the video, see if you can answer these questions. Okay, so first of all, did they have a lot of food? Ben Fogle, yes. Captain Scott, they didn't have much, and what they did, they had the ration, so they had to save. What food did they have? Ben Fogle, they had porridge, chocolate, chicken, spag bowl, mince, rice, and other things. Captain Scott, what did they have? They had sort of biscuits, horse meat, pemmican, dried beef, but they had to ration these. They were coming out to their last supply of them. Did food give them enjoyment? So both said yes, so that's a similar thing. Ben Fogle said yes, they enjoyed the breakfast and it was food from heaven. And Captain Scott said although they didn't have a lot of food, it raised their spirits, they enjoyed it. Any other similarities or differences? Well, generally they had different experiences with food because basically one had lots and one didn't have the other. So they didn't have that in common, however they both enjoyed the food and they both had sugar. And there it's together. So my red is what they didn't have in common. So they didn't have in common how much they had. They didn't have in common their different experiences. But the blue is what they did have in common. So So that's what they had, and they both enjoyed the food and both had sugar. Okay, so maybe if you're in the exam and you're just with a pen, you could do, excuse my messiness, you could just do this on like a little bit of the exam paper. So all I've done is put one extract on one side, Fogle on the left, Scott on the right, and just the main point. So Fogle, lots of food, Scott, not a lot. Fogle enjoyed the food, Scott enjoyed the food. Fogle, porridge, chocolate, chicken, mince, Scott, biscuits, meat. So I've just listed the food. So maybe if you just, instead of like highlighting, if you did that on your exam paper, maybe that would make you obvious, and it'd be quite easy for you to pick out what was the same or what was the difference. So how are we going to structure the answer? So that's the main thing. How are we going to get this down on the page? So let's look at structure. So first of all, you need to start off with an overview. So your first sentence should be, as a whole, what is the main thing? So do both texts agree about the food, or do both texts maybe differ about the food? So I think, then you need a quote from extract 1, then you need a quote from extract 2, and then also if we think of another point to say, another thing that both texts agree with or disagree with, and then a quote from each one. So my overview, I'm going to use the sentence starter, both writers, and I'm going to say something about that. So then give your overview, main point summary of the question. So my main thing is, I think both writers have different experiences with the food on the expedition. So I've used the exam question with the food on the expedition for my first sentence. So I'm saying my main overview is both writers have different experiences with the food. Then I'm going to say a short quote from both extracts to prove this. So I've got my sentence starters, now I'm going to give a short quote from both to prove that they have different experiences. So Fogle had lots of food. Quote to prove it, salami, chocolate, cheese, chicken, spaghetti bolognese. Then I need my quote from Scott. In contrast, Scott had rationed meat, biscuits and a thin breakfast. If you wanted to go in detail and talk about thin, you could do. Look how I've put purple in contrast. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So all I've done is my overview, said they have different experiences, and then I've said, then I've proved it. Fogle had lots of food. Quote, Scott had hardly any food. Quote. Okay, then there it is together. So both writers have different experiences with the food on the expedition. Fogle had lots of food, salami, chocolate, cheese, chicken, spaghetti bolognese. In contrast, Scott had rationed meat, biscuits and a thin breakfast. Really clear, really easy. So want to get high marks, use adverbials. Okay, so these are things like similarly, on the other hand, likewise, in contrast. So remember, we are saying what is the difference and what is a similarity. So using these will show the examiner you thought about what is the same, what is the difference, that you've picked up on the subtle differences and similarities in the texts. So let's see if we can do another point. So my other point is that if we looked at our little plan, its similarity is that they were both quite positive about the food. So my little sentence starter, in both texts food brings a positivity to the expedition to the men. Now I need to prove it. Fogle enjoyed the breakfast. Scott said it raised the spirits. So there's my answer. And there it is together. So my point is they were positive. My quote is Fogle enjoyed it. Scott said it raised the spirits. I don't need to go into a lengthy explanation. I've given my quotes and I proved to the examiner that I've picked two things out from the two extracts. Do a finish with a little summing up sentence. Only if you have time. If you're struggling, don't do it. So all I'm doing is summing up my answer really. So in summary, although the pair had different amounts of food, they both enjoyed the small relief it brought them on their traffic journey. So again, I read into the factors that even though they had a really bleak mood, the food actually helped them in some way. Okay, so there we go. So here it all is together. Both writers had different experiences with the food on the expedition. Fogle had lots of food. In contrast, Scott had a rationed meat, biscuits and a thin breakfast. In both texts, food brings a positivity to the expedition. Fogle enjoyed the breakfast. Scott said it raised the spirits. In summary, although the pair had different amounts of food, they both enjoyed the small relief it brought them on their traumatic journeys. So we just take away that bit because we don't necessarily need that. It'd be good to do. We don't have to do it. I've shown here that I've picked out two things. I've said one similarity, one difference they have, and I've got quotes from etc. to prove it. I've picked out basic information. Remember, that's what we wanted. I've picked out basic information from two separate texts, and I put it into my answer. So again, summary of the whole question then, tips. It's the first compare question. It's worth 4 marks. Remember, don't spend a lot of time on it. 5 or 6 minutes. How many points should you make? 2 separate points and give quotes for each one. And what do we need to avoid? Terminology and lengthy exploration. So we're not doing PE. So follow this and hopefully you'll do well on this question and you'll have a successful grade for question 5 of the paper 2 exam.
Hi everyone, this video is looking at
paper 2 of the EDUQAS GCSE English Language. This is looking at question 6, which is the second compare question. So like I said, it will be the final question in the exam. So right at the bottom of your screen there. So for this question, it's question 6, like I said. How many marks? It's worth 10 marks. How many points or quotes should you make? You're looking to make 5 comparisons between the two texts with quotes. How are you going to get your marks? Quotes from each extract to support points of comparison. Analysis of the effect on the reader. So that's basically 2 of your bullet points. And what do you need to avoid? So we don't need a lot of terminology. You can use some terminology, but you're not going to be waffling. So we don't need 7-line point evidence explains. You just need to find the information and say why it's been used. So if we look at the question then, it's question 6. Both of these texts are about expeditions to the South Pole. Compare the hardships Scott and Fogle endured on their expeditions, how Scott and Fogle got their feelings about the hardships across to the reader. So basically, first bullet point is what are the bad things and negative things they had to go through, but then also how did the writer get this across. So like I said, it's 10 marks, so that means you should be spending about 13 to 15 minutes. How many points and quotes? So we said where you make 5 points with a quote from both extracts on each of the points. I would say this is the most complex question in the exam because it's a bit of it's a mixture there. We've got the how question, but we've also got to get a bit of information retrieval in there. So I'd say it's the toughest one. So it's the last question in the exam, which on average students do the worst on, but it's through time management. So you've got to make sure you give yourself 15 or 16 minutes to answer this question. So you would already read both texts in the exam. So on questions 1, 2, 3 and 4, you've already read these texts. So you're going to be familiar with them. So it probably means you're going to be skimming on this question rather than reading the whole thing and taking 10 minutes or so to do so. You can say both texts are the same or different. In fact, you probably will be saying that. But be clear which one you're talking about. So a really easy way of doing this is just use their names. So Fogle and Scott. If the examiner doesn't know which one you're talking about, you're not going to get a mark. So don't fail this question just by doing something silly like that. And don't worry if you feel like you might be repeating points you've already written in past questions. So it is question 6. So you might be feeling like you're repeating part of the how question from question 2. Don't worry about that. Just answer the question. If the quote is needed, use that quote. Don't worry about repeating yourself. You're going to be asked to compare the things the two writers said on a topic. This means picking out the similarities and differences in what they say, and also importantly how they say it. So you want to get high marks in these questions? Well, let's use these kind of words. So simile, on the other hand, likewise, in contrast, whereas, in comparison. So using these words, these are showing to the examiner that you're comparing and contrasting. So it's really important if you use these kind of words. So basically you need to try and find something that links and connects the extracts in some way. These extracts haven't been picked by random, they've been picked. So there are things that are going to be linking, so try and find what these are. Obviously you're hopefully going to get the obvious ones, but where you're going to get higher marks is maybe reading between the lines and more subtle things that you've read into. So you can look at the two extracts, and if you want this extract, it's the Ben Fogle Captain Scott. There is a link to the exam paper in the YouTube video. So you need to look for something that is similar, but maybe the writer has communicated it in a different way. So for example, in these texts you're going to say that they both suffered with the weather, but you're going to say maybe they talk about it in a different way. Terminology is not needed, so you can use a little bit. If it comes easy to you, say it's an adjective, say it's a verb, but we don't really need it a lot in this question. So there's the question again then. It's about the South Pole. You need to compare the things they've went through, and then also how Scott and Fogle, who are the writers of the extract, get their feelings across the hardships. So remember, it is about the hardships, so you don't need to talk about other stuff. So be specific to the question. So we don't need to say that Ben Fogle had a really nice time on the trip, because that's not what the question's about. It's things that they suffered. So I want you to do now, do it together or pause the video, track through both texts, so go from start to bottom of the highlighter and look for key parts about the question. So just about the things they've suffered, and then highlight the key points. So here's my highlight, what I've highlighted. So I've highlighted thought he was going to die. So it's important to talk about structure. So it literally starts with that he thinks he was going to die. Then another hardship they had to go through was the physical side of it. So they had to walk 480 miles of snow in 18 days. Okay. The weather, so it was minus 50 degrees at times. It's called hostile, it's called advanced. Medical problems, so they had hypothermia, frostbite, lips, blisters, pneumonia, so all of these chest infections. They had loads of stuff to do with medical problems, so that's something they had to suffer. Even the tent, so in this extract, they had a small 3-man tent, but it was lightweight and it was able to handle the Atlantic storms. And also this extract, if you talk about we comment on the structure of it, it starts off with a dramatic moment and it ends on a high. So it actually starts off as its most dramatic moment and then sort of goes down throughout the article and it ends on a high note where he's laughing on the he's laughing about what the trip was like. Other things we could have talked about were that he finished the race. Yeah, maybe that's not to do with hardships too much. But then it says they had a vast hostile landscape. So what does hostile have connotations with? Aggression, hostility. Yeah. They didn't eat enough, so you could talk about the food. They burnt 9,000 calories a day, but they were only getting 3,500. They thought the food was disgusting at some point. So there's the first one. Then we look at the second extract. Let's have a look. So it starts badly, a bit like the other one. So they both start really badly. Ben Fogle starts thinking he's going to die. This one starts, they've woken up to a really aggressive storm. They had little food, a thin breakfast, and the food they did have had to be rationed. The weather, it was really awful weather, howling blizzard, raging violently. The tent, so as in comparison to Ben Fogle, who had a good tent, this one's got a 19th century tent where the tent is absolutely wet through, it's very, very wet, very, very uncomfortable. And this one ends badly. So the Ben Fogle one started on a high. This one ends really badly wet. It's almost at their state where they think they're going to die. It's an absolute hopeless situation. Other things we could have talked about were, again, the weather is awful. It's utterly miserable. His mood is really bad and he feels like the situation is hopeless. So what I would do now for this question, you could do this on your exam, is draw a really simple table out like I've got. I put Fogle on one side, Scott on the other side, and then all I'm going to do is list as I go through the extract, list the hardships, and list the things they've had to suffer. So I've just started with Fogle thought he was going to die, and then physical exhaustion, 481 miles. So those are the first two things I've found. And then Scott, raging howling blizzard, thin breakfast. So just go down it on each extract and see if you can find 4 or 5 hardships that you can talk about in your exam. Okay, after you've done that, I want you to number the bullet points on both extracts to see where linked. So on my Fogle one, I've got thought he was going to die, physical exhaustion, finished the race, medical problems, cold, hostile environment, not eating enough, dinner disgusting, good tent, starts on a low, ends on a high, and it's past tense. So what I mean by past tense is that Fogle was looking back on the whole thing. We know he survived, we know he's been okay. For Scott, I've got raging howling blizzard, thin breakfast, awful weather, tents were wet through, spirits were down, he was miserable, not a lot of food left. It starts on a low point and ends on a low point. He cannot move, it's impossible to move. Present tense. Okay, so what I mean by that is Scott is going through this as we're hearing how he's going as he's doing it. So we don't know if Scott's going to be okay. So the reader would be worried about Scott. So how am I going to link these things? So number one, thought he was going to die. That's Fogle. I'm going to link that to that he can't move in an impossible situation with Scott. Number two, past tense. Okay, so what I'm going to compare it, I'm going to say Fogle is looking back on it, while Scott, number two, is present tense, so he's going through it at the moment. Number three, we're going to talk about enjoying the trip. Well, I don't like that one, so I'm going to forget that one. It's not a great point. But number four, we can talk about the food. So number four for Fogle, I've got not eating enough, and then for Scott, I've got thin breakfast, and they're rationing their food. So I'm going to talk about those two together. Number five, Fogle, I've got cold, minus 50 degrees, minus 50 centigrade. And Scott, I've got awful weather. So I've got to go linking those ones. So you'll see what I've done is I've linked them all up in the table, left to right. So then I'm going to compare. It doesn't always have to be the same, or it doesn't have to be different. There's probably going to be a mixture of the two. But this is a really simple way of seeing on a page. You can do it on an exam page. Really seeing, really simply, really easily where they match up, what compares, what doesn't compare. So how are we going to structure our answer then, now that we've got our things that we're going to compare and not compare? So, structure. Use the sentence starter both writers. So it shows straight away to the examiner I'm going to be comparing. We're talking about two extracts. Then you are going to give an overview of the main question. So I'm going to say both writers suggest, so not really an overview, I'm just going to go into my first point. Both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship on the trip. Okay, remember, I'm linking back to the question. The question said hardship, I'm putting hardship in my little intro. So both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship. Now all I'm going to say now is what tells me that from extract 1 and what tells me that from extract 2. Okay, Fogle says the temperature was sometimes -50 and were bitterly cold, which suggests the weather is extremely harsh. So it isn't an easy search and find question, so I've not just put bitterly cold, I'm putting what that quote suggests. So bitterly suggests the weather was extremely harsh. It's not just cold, it's bitterly cold. Okay, if I wanted to, I could add it's an adverb there that's been used. Then also I've put similarly, Scott says the storm moved on violently. Both writers use adverb to show the pain and punishment they receive from the weather. So, in the first paragraph and the first line of the second bit, I've said what hardships, and then the second part I've answered the second bullet point. I've said what effect does it have? Well, I've said that the fact they've used bitterly and violently, they're both adverbs, but they're both adverbs to show the pain and punishment they receive from the weather. They're both adverbs that show the reader how awful the conditions were. And then also I've got my little adverbial there, my simile, so I'm saying that at this point they actually talk about the same things about the weather. They're both saying how awful the weather is. Okay, again, these are the words I'm using. Similarly, on the other hand, likewise, in comparison, in contrast. Okay, so there are loads of points I've got. So it looks like I've got 6 points there, which is really good. I've done really well. But remember, and there's all the adverbials there in comparison, whereas, simile, in contrast, yeah. On the other hand, things like that. So there I've shown I'm using them, shown the example I'm comparing. But I've only done 6 points, which is really good. If I'm doing that, I'm doing really well. I've also put in loads of quotes. So even though there's 6 points, how many quotes have I got here? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've probably got 15 quotes in my 6 points. The examiners love you using quotes. As many quotes as you can use. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, they call it tracking through the text. So if you show that you've got quotes from the start, middle and end, they will absolutely love you for it. Okay. Okay, and also, yes, so my yellow there are my quotes if you didn't work that out. So let's go through a few points we're going to make. So each time what I'm going to do is I'm going to say both writers say something, then I'm going to give a quote from each one, and I might say that both writers say something, however they do it in different ways or they do it in the same way. So both writers use punishing vocab to describe the hardships they suffered. That's the point I'm making. Fogle says the landscape is hostile, suggesting it's aggressive and something they're fighting against. Similarly, the motif of aggression is present with Scott when he uses the adjective raging to describe the environment. So each one I've said hostile has been used because it shows how awful it is. Raging has been used to show how awful it is. But I've also explained why they've used those words. They could have just said it was really miserable, but they've used hostile and they've used raging for a reason. The writer wants to get something across. So hostile, if someone, it's almost like someone who wants to fight you or something, isn't it? So I've said it's aggressive. Well, I've said raging again. If someone is in a rage with you, they're violent, they're temperamental. Yeah. So that is what they're suggesting about the weather. Also, I've got my adverbial in there with simile. Okay, both expeditions to the South Pole suffered major problems. Okay, so that's my point. The main hardship for Fogle was that he thought he was going to die, which tells the reader the expedition was nearly fatal. So again, using a quote, I've explained the quote. In comparison, so now I'm saying they've done a different thing. So in comparison, Scott's trip seems to be just as dangerous as all of us are certain it's impossible to move. Okay, then I've zoomed in on the quote. Why had they just said, he could have just said, I think it's impossible, but he said all of us. Why have they done that? Well, all suggests that Scott is not just being paranoid, but it's the whole group. And the reader, importantly, because they're talking to us, know they're in a bleak situation. So if I just said, I think it's impossible, people would probably believe me. But if we had a group of us and we all said it, a collective, then people are really going to take that seriously. Okay, another difference, my point. One difference in how the hardships are put across to the reader is the timing of the writing. So now I'm going to talk about something that they contrast. In the article, Fogle was looking back on what has happened to him, whereas Scott is writing things as they happen. Then the effect on the reader. The reader knows that Fogle is safe, but is still afraid for Scott after the extract, which makes it more dramatic. Fogle is being interviewed, whereas Scott is writing a diary. So Scott being a first-hand account makes it more personal and direct, whereas Fogle is a bit more removed. It's a bit more removed because there's a middleman, isn't it? It's not just Fogle talking to us, it's Fogle talking to the interviewer, who's then giving it to us. So it makes it a bit more personal for Scott, who's literally writing the diaries that he thought were just for him. Use of whereas shows me the comparison and contrast. Point. Both writers show that food was a hardship for Fogle. Fogle says people back home would think it was disgusting and they weren't eating enough calories. However, they did have lots of food, salami, chocolate, cheese, blah, blah, blah. In contrast, I'm saying this is a different thing. In contrast, Scott had ration meat, biscuits and a thin breakfast, suggesting we're starving. Okay, I've zoomed in on the word thin. Why have they said thin? To suggest they're really hungry. And also the word ration suggests they will become hungrier as their portion size diminishes. So if you ration your food, it means you're getting less. Both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship on the trip. Okay, we've talked about this one, so we'll say it anyway. Fogle says the temperature was sometimes -50 and was bitterly cold, which suggests the weather was extremely harsh. Scott says the storm moved violently. Both writers, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that one. And then Scott also had to suffer the hardship of the 19th century tech, which is very, very wet, whereas Fogle's modern version was lightweight and triumphed over the bitter storm. So, really simple point. I've just compared. One of the temps was brilliant, one of them was rubbish. So, talked about that. Another point, both writers use structure differently to describe the hardships. Fogle starts with the most dramatic moment, I thought I was going to die, but then gets more positive, whereas Scott's diary becomes more and more dramatic as time goes on. So, I've said that they've got in common that they use structure to describe how bad it is, but then I've said, well, but actually they differ in terms of what they do. So Fogle, we start with a dramatic moment to get the reader's attention and go down, where all the way through with Scott, the tension builds and gets the reader more and more into it as we get on. So they almost do it in an opposite way. Okay, so there you are, they're all together. And also, there probably could have been 10 or 11 things that I could have written about, but I've just picked my 6 that I like. Okay, and here's another example. This is a grade, so that one I showed you was sort of like a higher version. This is a grade 4 or 5 version, so read it through. Basically, the person makes quite a lot of good points, but they don't do the second bullet point. So the first bullet point is saying all the hardships they do. Brilliant, they've done really well there, but they've done nothing about the second bullet point. So they've said nothing about how it affects the reader. So you say all the hardships. So for example, you say they compare how they talk about the weather, but then they've not gone into the details. So they've not said raging weather. So what does raging suggest? Well, raging suggests it's aggressive, it's almost punishing the men. So they've done one bullet point, but they need to do the second bullet point, and so do you if you want to get good grades. Okay, to sum up then this question, it's the second compare question, number 6. It's worth 10 marks. You should be looking for 5 comparisons with quotes for each one, and an analysis on the effect in reader. So you're going to get marks for picking out the quotes, picking out and saying why it's hard, but then you're going to say, well, why has the writer done what they've done? What do you need to do? We don't need loads of terminology, and do not waffle. So hopefully this has been a good insight into this question for you. Hopefully you'll be a bit more confident in this question. It's the last question in the exam, so hopefully you can fly out the exam knowing how confident you are, and hopefully you'll get great marks.